So we would like to start this chapter by asking our viewer to take a second to just close their eyes, imagine a human being with no specific identity, like a specific way of looking, and just they're walking in a street or they're in a particular context where there is a lot of people. And suddenly all these people are one by one just pointing out comments like, "Get out, you're not us, like us, we don't want you, you don't belong here." And after imagining that, we have two reflective questions for our viewer. The first one is, how do you think is this person feeling? So think a bit about the emotions that are at play there. But more importantly, we want you to focus also a little bit as to who do you think this identity is? Who do you think is this person? Who could they be in your perhaps in your particular context? Maybe you are identifying yourself with this person, okay? And just use that as an introduction to the whole chapter in itself.
So, as you might imagine, our starting question would then be, who is the other? And as you might have noticed also from our example, we are dealing in this chapter with a very general concept of otherness, and not with specific dimensions of diversity or specific groups. And this is for two reasons. The first one is that we are taking here a constructivistic stance in the definition of otherness, which means that we acknowledge the fact that diversity and otherness are not fixed, are not given once and for all, and they actually have nothing to do with the intrinsic characteristics of the single individual, but rather on the meaning which is attributed to them within a specific context, within a specific culture or community. And this means, for example, that what I consider different, or rather who I consider as being the other, might not be the same as for you or for someone living, for example, in a different country. The second reason is why we are not referring here to specific dimensions of diversity is because we don't want to reproduce othering processes by defining someone as other by ourselves. And actually, the concept of othering is the very starting point of our chapter. The term was originally coined within the post-colonial theory, but it has deeper roots and draws on a very long philosophical and theoretical tradition in different fields, such as sociology, psychology, anthropology, among others. So since then, different authors coming from different fields have dealt with different forms of othering, and you can read some of them. So we are explaining some of them in our chapter, and have tried to explain how such processes actually take place in society, and what are the consequences of what are their consequences, especially for those people who are recognized as the others, that is, for the ones who are othered. Othering can be defined as an imposed state of difference. So this means that someone is attributing difference to someone else, and it's using this difference to define his or her or their identity. And this is achieved through a process of self-other distancing, which is based on binary and opposing categories like self-other, us, them, in-group, out-group, where the us constitutes the norm, the center, and it's always positively connoted, while the them are the ones who are deviating from that norm and therefore placed at the margins and also always negatively connoted. So this could be based, for example, of one's ethnicity, language, religion, ability, or gender or sexual orientation, or whatever. But also a combination of such characteristics or identities So it's very important to keep in mind that some people might be experiencing othering at different levels because of their multiple identities, and this is what is called intersectionality. So all of this brings our attention to the social and the cultural practices that and the discourses that are involved in the process of definition and the construction of the other.
So the construction of the other is a process deeply rooted in power dynamics, discourses, practices, and knowledge production. This process is fundamental to understanding how social exclusion and discrimination operate within various contexts, including educational settings. First, looking into how the power dynamics are established, those in position of power, often representing dominant social groups, have the means to create and disseminate knowledge about both themselves and those they deem as others. This power allows the dominant social groups to control the discourse through establishing power and reinforcing stereotypes about the way society talks, understands about different groups. Stereotypes, being oversimplified and often inaccurate beliefs about a group, serve as the cognitive foundation of prejudice. These stereotypes, when internalized by society, contribute to the formation of in-groups and out-groups. So in-groups, those who are perceived as similar to oneself, and out-group, those who are perceived as other or different from us. The knowledge produced and circulated by those in power tends to favor the in-group while often misrepresenting the out-group. This biased knowledge creation forms a cycle where the power influences the discourse and which shapes the knowledge, and again it comes back in a circle which justifies and maintains existing power structures. This cycle can be incredibly difficult to break, as the in-group or those in power benefit from it. Prejudice, the negative attitudes towards out-group based on stereotypes, has both cognitive and emotional components. The cognitive aspect involves the stereotypical beliefs about the out-group, while the emotional element includes the feelings of fear, uncertainty, or anger towards them. These prejudices lead to discrimination, which is unfair treatment of individuals based on their group membership. Again, coming back to the power dynamics between the oppressor and the oppressed, play a crucial role in this whole process. The oppressor, holding the societal power, can reinforce their position by keeping the other away from the centers of influence and decision making. This exclusion prevents the marginalized groups from challenging existing narratives or contributing to knowledge production, thereby again perpetuating their otherness. Moreover, those in power often have the means to widely disseminate their views through various platforms like media, social media, education systems, and cultural institutions. This influence and shapes the societal norms and values, often normalizing the marginalization of certain groups. The knowledge and cultural models about otherness shared in a given context play a crucial role, as they are incorporated into individuals' social representations, which in turn influence their attitudes. Research on peer attitudes towards inclusive schooling, especially towards students from different groups, has shown a significant positive relationship between attitudes and a social participation. So this suggests that the negative peer attitudes are likely to give rise to exclusionary or avoiding behaviors, hindering the participation of the students who are in the school. These findings indicate that the inclusion of students identified as other may be at risk. which suggest a direct link between otherness and exclusion, and especially in here, peer exclusion. Coming back to the emotional aspect of prejudice and how it should not be underestimated, especially the emotional aspect of it. Fear of the unknown or different, coupled with the tendency to seek belonging within an in-group, can lead to emotional reactions against perceived outgroups. So it is important to know that the different emotions in the process of othering.
To latch on to what Damini was saying, by referring to the emotional level, we think that the emotional level is very important because it is a form of how you concretize and you reproduce or produce this sort of barrier between the majority and the minority or the marginalized group who is being perceived or labeled as the other. Okay, so it is very important to identify the emotions that are at play there because they have a very strong potential of maintaining that or reproducing it. In the chapter, we do this both from the emotions of the in-group, so the majority, but also mostly then we focus on the emotions that are at play for the out-group and how do they maintain the status quo or this divide, right? And basically, we would, if we had to quickly label or like identify some of the emotions that are usually at play from the in-group, the majority, these tend to be labeled under the notion of phobia, okay? And when you look deeper into them, these can manifest themselves into from anger, bitterness, fear, uncertainty, and frustration, okay? And frustration, for example, could not just necessarily be frustration with the other, but also the institutions that fail to take care of the other. This is something that maybe also takes place in schools, all right? So it's very important to analyze them both. And in no way, when we're mentioning these emotions and elaborating them in the chapter, we are trying to justify them. Again, we are just simply trying to locate them so that we can then identify exactly the powers that are at play in maintaining these emotions. But now, obviously, we need to mostly focus on the emotions that are experienced by those who are othered. Okay, and again, fear is one of them because obviously you're feeling like unwanted. But if we had to maybe properly analyze exactly where it is all stemming from, there is a specific, some work that establishes that the main emotion is in fact shame, because shame involves the relationship of the individual with society, first of all. So there is this constant battle between the individual and the other. The group, okay, and wanting to belong to a social group, which is a natural human behavior after all. And shame in itself is very important during this process, because even when you think about, for example, the examples we were giving in the example case, when you look closely at the words that we used, most of them tend to try to direct the emotion or the behavior by shaming. So for example, being like, don't do that, we don't do that here, that's different from us. So by establishing that, you're sort of producing an emotional reaction, which tends to be shame. And through that shame, you then are colonizing the psychic space. So colonization there is not perhaps a geographical one, but it's actually a psychological and emotional one. You are literally conditioning the individual to behave in a certain way, which is preferred by the majority, all right? And therefore you are concretizing those sort of parameters that we are distinguishing between the in-group and the out-group. What is, however, also important to keep in mind when we talk about this sort of paralyzing effect that shame can also have, this controlling effect. It is also important to bear in mind and look at the history of many minorities who have used that shame actually to be productive with it. And therefore there is a duality in it as an emotion. Why? Because at the end of the day, it is used also to counteract the silencing, counteract and making the marginalized actually visible. Okay, there are different examples of how this took place throughout different periods. So that would be, I don't know, for the LGBT movement, it's the Stonewall movement, or the Me Too movement for women, or Black Lives Matter for ethnicity, and many others, because all of those are technically coming from a Western one. So it is through this sort of revolt, going against this emotion, that this emotion tends to actually be also productive. It's not necessarily an emotion which just simply paralyzes, right? And that is the important element there, that when this is seen or when this is felt, it is something that is to be reflected on and not simply just accepted, but also, used as a sort of motivation to actually counter-argue and produce something which makes the other visible and heard. So obviously for now, we have mostly focused on all of this in a greater context of society in general. And now we would like to shift actually our focus mostly to the school context, because obviously the viewers here are teachers in training. So what are the ways of how this manifests itself in school and at what levels? And also then what are the ways that we can mitigate this and limit the impact of such othering from taking place?
So, othering processes often take shape in schools. The search for the causes is a very complex undertaking, as various factors and actors come into play at different levels. Between structural and cultural aspects, we can distinguish the level of the self, the dynamics in the classroom, the decisions at the level of school management and the governance, and what is happening in the broader social and cultural context. Reflection on the dimension of the self is crucial and involves different actors: teachers, students, school leaders, families. Within a kind of cognitive economy, each of us interprets the world through categories and schemas. We need to be aware of this dynamic in order to avoid developing stereotypes and prejudice that can be lead to real discrimination and compartmentalized understating of reality. Going to school with stereotypical and prejudiced views run the risk of othering processes. Based on a false and non-existent idea of the norm, certain groups of people are defined as different because of they differ from the dominant group. These create real inequalities that have a major impact on pupils' well-being and their chances of success at school. In the classroom, this means that the history and perspective of the country you live in and the Western country in general take center stage. There is no space for other visions and meanings. Everyone must conform to the dominant discourse. The idea of co-construction of knowledge is not realized. Instead, we witness forms of cultural transmission where it is necessary to adapt to the thinking of the majority. This affects both the pedagogical relationships with teachers and students and the relationship between peers. The school culture conveys of hierarchy in terms of languages, countries of origin, gender, social classes, and many other dimensions, conveying a colonial view that excludes those who are perceived as different. The role of school management, in which teachers, school leaders, parents, and sometimes students are entrusted with the more institutional task, is crucial. This is where rules and form or organization are established. This is where colonial elites school culture based on the idea of the norm can be changed. In fact, any attempt to approach homogeneity is artificial and doomed to failure. Heterogeneity is characteristics inherent to all social groups. To create a situation of homogeneity in schools is to be bearer of a mindset that is not open to diversity and to the recognition that everyone has multiple belongings. Phenomena of school segregation and curricula that don't include histories other than the national one are two clear examples of how the institutional level can generate process of othering with negative consequences for educational pathways. The social, political, cultural context has a major impact on both school systems and individuals. when inequities exist at the structural level in terms of access to resources and social and civil rights, in terms of social norms and values, at the level of prevailing policies and discourses, and when inequalities become institutionalized, it's not only urgent a change on the part of the individual, but also, and more importantly, a paradigm shift involving policymakers and society as a whole. In this sense, individuals can play a crucial role in recognizing forms of injustice and oppression and making their voices heard by the institutions that can change the social order. The dynamics we describe here are certainly complex and have been layered over the course of thousands of years of history. Therefore, it is difficult to arrange the dominant discourses and practices of the subaltern, and there are no ready-made solutions.
So, what can the school do in this respect?
Yeah, if we think of the school context, work on the individual and the professional self at the institutional level must be mediated through the dimension of collegiality. It is essential to promote self-awareness of groups in which positions of privilege or marginality can emerge that affect professional practice in relationships with the students and between teachers, in relationships with the school leaders and families. Being aware of these dynamics is the first step to manage what produce processes of ordering and inequalities in pedagogical practices. At the institutional level, it is important to develop educational policies at the individual school level that promotes equity, inclusion, belonging, and valuing the uniqueness of each individual. The curriculum needs to be decolonized by giving importance to other languages, other histories, and other narratives, giving voice to marginalized groups and those who cannot normally participate in decision-making processes, and imaging new forms of teaching and learning. This has an impact on pedagogical practices in the classroom. From the transmissive model, we are moving to forms of teaching that typify active learning, where the student's diverse and unique perspective is valued through dialogic and collaborative processes. The school and its actors can play an essential role at the policy level when it comes to activism and social change. As teachers, leaders, parents, and students, we must have the courage to bring demands for equity and social justice to the public debate, and to raise broad awareness of ordering processes and all those groups that are excluded or marginalized because they bring some diversity to the dominant model. This political role of schools has been repeatedly emphasized by us and by colleagues who have worked on other issues. A pedagogical attention and awareness of the colonial mechanism that characterize our society is indispensable to promote diverse discourses and practices at every level, personal, classroom level, institutional and political, against dominant thinkings, and go beyond the classification as them in order to be able to cultivate the other in us.